All right, so today I want to talk about the increasing legislation kind of banning drag shows, and more importantly, the attention being placed on drag shows right now. So I learned this up, I looked this up the other day. The history of drag shows goes back 100 years, to the 1920s, very much in the form that you see it now, which is very kind of ostentatious, theatrical, hyper feminine. I had been trying to see if it was kind of rooted in vaudeville because I know that men dressing as women was popular there as kind of part of the artistic expression. I didn't see any, direct, you know, uh, transition there as far as of how that came to be, but the history it goes back far, and to be honest, it hasn't been a particularly contentious issue for most of that history. I think you look at the Rocky Horror Picture Show, certified classic. I remember when I was growing up, the Drew Carey Show. I don't know how many people watched that, but that was a very kind of like, you think about your average like middle America, non-political, palatable sitcom, right? In the vein of kind of something like King of Queens. It's not even super liberal, like Seinfeld's talked about abortion, and they had a lot of gay friends in the show. So again, things that could kind of be even more liberal. Drew Carey was a very was from Cleveland. Four friends drinking beer, and Drew Carey's brother was he dressed in drag. No issue, no backlash, and so now you're having a thing where it's become very very big. It's become very centered. In a ton of talks in Texas, Florida, I think nationally, but those are kind of the areas where you see the governors kind of really vying for a national stage. I think there's two reasons for this. I think one, both parties right now are really looking for ways to motivate their base in a very emotionally extreme manner. This is one of the things that I find most disgusting about the current political system, is that substance has completely given away to emotional gravity, right? And both parties, I think, have realized it's way easier and way cheaper to motivate your base by getting them angry, upset, saying we are under attack. And so you have, I think, a pretty small set of people who dress in drag. You think about relative to the total population, it's not an issue that affects many people on any side, and yet it's become a dominant part of the discussion, right? And why is that? Is because you have liberals on one side saying we need to protect the most vulnerable, and you have conservatives saying that we need to protect our kids. They're saying the same thing. We need to protect the most vulnerable. Our kids are being sexualized. And on the left side, they're saying, the trans and gay community is being targeted. So both sides somehow claim to be protecting the most vulnerable, because you know why? When you protect the most vulnerable, your whole base gets excited, and it's bullshit, and it's not that I don't support anybody, I'm pro individual rights. I think that includes dressing in drag. I don't really understand why anyone cares how anyone else dresses. To the extent that it would be in a sexual capacity, it has to be taken on a case by case basis. If someone is doing something that's sexually inappropriate, regardless of their sexual orientation, that's not cool. But I think blanket sweeping that under drag is not super accurate. But what frustrates me is why this has become such a dominant part of the conversation, and the way in which it has been twisted, which this has become a central issue. I have arguments with this about people because I say we haven't moved on from trying to fix the abortion bans. This is still something that's rolling out, and less than a year after the Supreme Court rolled out, now we're on to legislation protecting drag queens, and so it's like what happened. We're just abandoning the abortion issues, and so I think what you see is that it's very easy for politicians to really harp on something that's emotionally charged and doesn't actually require them to spend money, so that they can all still kind of like get away with pleasing their various corporate interests, and say that this is the issue of our time that we need to talk about. I think the second reason why it's become really big is the increasing talk about the trans community, and I think drag kind of gets roped into that. What is or is not a man or woman, socially, dress-wise, and I actually think they're pretty distinct issues. I'm not super involved with the drag community or the trans community, so this is a little bit more, conjecture. I'm not super well versed in this area, but my understanding is that drag is uh, does, drag by definition is a man dressing as a woman, not a trans woman who I would say considers herself a woman just dressing as herself, right? It's kind of like a cross gender socialization. So I'm not entirely sure if it translates directly to uh, the trans, like what legislation would enforce or prevent, transitioning or, going to the bathroom of your gender. I imagine strongly that the people that oppose drag shows are also the people that oppose the trans community, so I understand how those get lumped together, but I don't know that from a legal standpoint if they're actually as connected, but it certainly seems from a social one, those two get lumped together. But I think that, again, even within the lumping of the trans community, I think, whatever percent trans people are within the American and global population, very, very small compared to almost every other group you could think of, right? So why have they become such a center of conversation, both from being targeted and from being defended? And to me, it seems, to me it seems glaringly obvious that, again, it's a very easy way to polarize and motivate your audience in either direction. And I think that people who are unable to see it, I tend to argue with a lot more liberals than conservatives, which is oddly because I actually feel like I align more with liberal values. So what happens is I actually find myself arguing with liberals about strategy and tactics. I think that there is no way for me to look at the current landscape of the Democrat Party and not say it has been a colossal failure. All of the things that Democrats stand for, we are losing out, and especially with the erosion of individual liberties, abortion in particular, which was after 50, 60 years of Roe v. Wade that got rolled back. I cannot believe how little Democrats did in response to that. I thought that was a straight up travesty how they commandeered the Supreme Court. They withheld a Supreme Court justice, and then they confirmed another one against their own logic as to why in an election year it's fair to let the voters decide. So just extreme hypocrisy how they stacked the Supreme Court. And then within the Supreme Court itself, they're ruling, if you actually read it, the prospectus, they're saying this wasn't around, abortion wasn't around when the founding fathers were around, and therefore their logic or their reasoning doesn't apply to this issue because they weren't around. But then they go in to say that this is a particularly socially impactful decision issue, and so their ruling only applies to abortion. Their logic only applies to abortion because everyone knows that the Supreme Court is constantly ruling on things that came about conceptually after the founding fathers. The idea that you would only apply the American Constitution to things that existed during the 1700s is fucking ridiculous. The entire ruling was so ridiculous. It really, really is one of the most upsetting things that's happened to me in my lifetime. And regardless of how I feel about abortion, if it was a thing that I felt the majority of Americans supported, and it was something that I felt that a majority of Americans in a constitutional manner banned, I would have way less of a problem with it. I would say, listen, I'm going to still fight for abortion, but at least this was done in a legal way that respected our citizen demands. The majority of Americans want abortion. The majority, in the way in which the Supreme Court commandeered it was an absolute travesty of democracy. That's my opinion there. That's a sidebar, and the reason I bring up that sidebar is, again, because we're just losing battles, right? Is one after another, we're losing battles, and I think that what happens is you see people get super excited about the next issue that is somehow, again, the left saying we need to protect our most vulnerable, the right saying we need to protect our most vulnerable. Everybody somehow claims to be doing the same thing for a different group, and nothing is actually done on a substantive basis that feels like it's meaningful. And so with the drag shows specifically, I imagine that this will go on as long as it can, because it's such a charged issue. I think people have really strong feelings, even moderates. You think about how much does the average moderate care about taxes or these other things and stuff, and like they have pretty simple views, but then all of a sudden it comes to gender expression, sexualizing kids. You can get everybody freaked out, right? And so it's just really, I think, pretty ridiculous that it has this much focus, and I think that it's working, and it'll probably continue to happen. But I think for it to change, we would have to start seeing diminishing returns to championing the most socially charged issues. Until we don't do that, we're going to continue to see this. We're going to continue to see the massive polarization. We're going to continue to see the most hot button social issues. Even if they affect the least amount of people, they're going to continue to be the forefront of the discussion. And that's kind of what I probably think will happen.